You may remember in the haze of the general election, we covered a lot of the Conservatives saying, "What went wrong? How did we lose?" And I said at the time, there were going to emerge people from the Conservatives who get it exactly 100% right why they lost, and that those individuals were not going to be listened. They were going to be pushed to the sidelines. They were going to be the pariahs of the movement. And the two people that have emerged as those individuals that are not being listened to, that are considered absolute pariahs and heretics of the highest order. One is, of course, Rory Stewart out there, but you've also got David Gauke. And both of them, I'm not 100% sure on how much they align on issues, but it'd be very interesting to see a conversation between the two of them of, you know, what what could save the Conservative Party. I think that would be an interesting conversation. But as I've said before, it ain't going to get listened to because the direction of the Conservative Party at the moment is, and as I keep on saying, I'm going to cover the fall of the Conservative Party until the end because we are witnessing something we have not seen in British politics for a long time, and it is happening to the Conservative Party. Roll back to 2019 and say to someone, or imagine saying to someone that in 2025, the Conservative Party would have had the two big dramatic defeats, not only at a general election, but at a local election. It's hard to think of where we once were in 2019, where we were like, the Conservative Party generally looks unstoppable after that general election, to where we are now today. You could not have a more dramatic change. But if you were to time travel back to 2019 and say that to people, or find a Conservative supporter, they would laugh in your face. That wouldn't be conceivable to them. Remember, after the 2019 general election, they were talking about a decade, if not more, of being in power. How times have indeed changed. So, I suppose the big question is, will these people be listened to? Will Rory Stewart, will David Gauke ever, be, considered the luminaries maybe of a new Conservative movement? I doubt it, because that's not where the party is at the moment. It's just not where they are. And the more you watch that, the more you really examine the fact that they really are absolutely, the blind leading the blind in this case. So we're going to have a look, because David Gauke obviously written a piece in the light of the local election defeat saying, guys, this is not the direction we should be going in. And it's, once again, not going to be listened to. Not going to be listened to, because I guarantee you now, they are going to double down even more, because this is what the Tory party has been doing for years. They would implement a policy wouldn't work, they would double down on that policy. This is why you get an immigration policy that ended up with them wanting to deport people to Rwanda, because they refused to think about any alternatives in their policy or anything else like that, or consider any other ideas. And like I say, it's a mess of the party's entire own failing, and it is glorious to see a party flailing about like crazy. And like I say, imagine for a second time traveling back to 2019 in like the wake of their general election victory and telling someone, oh yeah, in 2025, this is your party's situation. Just imagine the reaction you would get for a second. Just imagine the reaction you get for a second. Anyway, I've babbled on for 5 minutes now. This is already going to be a long video. So please, before we do get on into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. And down below, of course, pardon me, there is the Patreon page, there's the Buy Me Coffee link, there's the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there's the Pony Club down below as well. And of course, if you are watching it live, I'm now doing live premieres for stuff, you can leave a super chat in the chat as well. So let's crack on then into this. David Gauke. The direction the Conservatives will be tempted towards to seek salvation is not the way they need to go. So let's see what he's got to say this. Politics is volatile and unpredictable. After the local election 4 years ago, Labour looked destined for a fifth general election defeat. The Tories were dominant. It did not turn out that way. But the scale of the collapse in the Conservative support last week and the emergence now of two parties capable of winning over very different parts of their voters leaves the party in an existential peril. And of course, reform is obviously one. The other is the Lib Dems. And I bring this up every time we've covered like any of these Conservatives. They worry and worry and worry so much about reform, and yet they forget about the Lib Dems. You know, it is the Lib Dems who will, I think, clean up the rest of the blue wall. Like, they will hoover up, I think, a lot more votes in the elections to come. I guarantee you that. That is their strategy. That is what they're going to do. I think you're also going to see Ed Davey probably not only just start to attack, you know, the Conservatives, but I think you're also going to see him start to attack reform. Because I think every party now is going to start attacking Farage on this. And like I say, expect a lot of scrutiny what goes on those local councils, as well as what goes on with those two regional mayors they've now got on. So, Conservative election victories have, of course, been based on achieving a broad coalition of support. Traditionally, the largest element has been made of the middle class who voted Tory on economic grounds. They were the voters who had most to lose from the higher taxes and inflation, which they associated with Labour governments. Suspicion of extremism, often pragmatic in approach, quietly patriotic. There were many small c Conservatives than large c Conservatives, but they ensured that the Tory party was dominant force in prosperous parts of cities and now wealthier shires. There was obviously always been an element to the Tory support that was more nationalistic and authoritarian in outlook. Once upon a time, the cause was the empire or opposition to the common market. Opposing immigration was always a priority. It would be a gross simplification to describe this as a purely working class Toryism. But it was a viewpoint that had an appeal beyond the conservative middle classes. At least, of course, since the mid-2020s, our politics has now realigned to this latter group and now became a larger and more powerful. Exactly. This is what you saw gain ground in the Tory party. The Tory members themselves were electing more and more hard right MPs into the party. Ultimately, through the 2000s, that was what would happen. And that put them eventually in the bad situation where they were, because it was the hard right of their party that is the source of all their problems. Just for some reason, they've yet to work that out yet. But, you know, maybe they will. Anyway, working class voters who shared their values, but of course remained loyal to Labour, did start to drift away from their traditional party. The economic arguments of the past were, of course, behind us. The social liberalism of much of the left aligned Labour, supporting now social conservatives. In parts of the country like the North Midlands, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, and Lincolnshire, the Conservative Party performed particularly strongly. Then came Brexit. A new geography was then exposed. The country was not divided by economic security, but by social values and educational background. This was disruptive for both the main political parties, but in 2019, the general election, that it was the Conservatives who benefited. Some of their traditional prosperous voters, of course, went elsewhere, but not many, thanks to Jeremy Corbyn. But the socially authoritarian Leave voters backed Boris Johnson's Conservative Party in very large numbers. The Red Wall, including many seats in the North Midlands, turned blue. And of course, the Grand Coalition, a coalition that, as we said at the time, many, many times, I often use the analogy, if you remember, Boris Johnson was spinning two plates. He was never going to be able to achieve them. And that coalition fell apart. So the Tories had a very broad coalition, but it was too fragile a coalition to actually survive the vicissitudes of governing in very turbulent times, or to be more accurate, governing badly in turbulent times. The reality, of course, Brexit underwhelmed its supporters and confirmed to its detractors that its advocates were not serious people. Again, very true. Brexit, we always said it at the time, oversold. Massively oversold to British people. More generally, the promises, of course, made were not kept, and on those only grounds, which the broad Tory coalition actually found agreement, was that the party had failed to meet the standards for integrity and competence that could have reasonably have been expected. The Conservatives suffered their worst general election defeat in 2024, and now the worst local election defeat. The worst case scenario for the Tories is that the authoritarian voters back reform. Middle class voters then back the Lib Dems, leaving the Tories with nothing. And honestly, that seems to be the way it will go. That seems to be ultimately the way it will go. That is how it is looking currently. And that is what I have said before, what I think will happen. Reform cannot win a majority just focusing on only the right-wing vote. It just can't. There are not enough hardcore right-wingers to form a government. Just not. One of the things we saw, and I will repeat this, one of the things we saw from the local elections was the fact low turnout. Low turnout. And Farage knows if he can motivate his supporters to go out and vote en masse, he can win in areas where the vote low turnout. And guess what? Some of the areas you saw an increase. Not by much, but by literal couple of points. Guess where the areas where we form one where that increase happened? You won't be too surprised. They now are in overall control of those councils. You can say low turnout. Bad things happen when you don't turn out to vote. But that's a topic for another time. Anyway, so as far as these elections are concerned, this is already happening. The North and Midland constituencies now all have Reform-controlled county councils. The Liberal Democrats are now the dominant party in many southern counties. This leaves the Conservative Party with a choice to make. It could be argued that to obtain a parliamentary majority, it needs to recover a broad coalition to win in both Berkhamsted and Bolsover. This is true, but it appears to be the current strategy. But it is also unrealistic. Which, again, I do agree with him on that. Massively unrealistic. Because they were always, after that loss, they were like, oh, we'll be back next time. Loveless landslide, we'll be back next time. Anyway, back to this. Obtaining, of course, a majority at the next general election is surely beyond this Conservative Party's reach. Its situation is much more serious than Labour's was 4 years ago. Which, again, very, very true indeed. Why? Were they saying, "Oh, we'll be back in 4 years," because it was based on, Keir Starmer's turning around of the Labour Party? Attempting, of course, to appeal to such a contrasting voters will now only continue to result in leaving everyone dissatisfied and unclear as to where the party stands. The second is now to redouble its efforts to appeal to its authoritarian voters, harden its position on immigration, wage war on woke, and react with fury to any close relationship with the EU. I wonder which direction they're going to go in. I wonder which direction we're going to go in. So, the most obvious political flaw with such a strategy is that these voters to whom this will appeal will already have a political party to vote for, Reform, led by a far more skilled communicator, Nigel Farage, than anyone the Tories have to offer. Again, very true. No matter if it's Kemi Badenoch or Robert Jenrick, why vote for Farage light where you can have full fat Farage in Reform? No. It's not going to re-win any of those lost voters to Reform. But until now, the argument the Tories have used, of course, against Reform, and of course, an argument that some had, of course, some success in the 2024 general election, is that a vote for Reform is a wasted vote that lets Labour in. After last week, that argument has much less force and, of course, in many places could be applied against the Tories themselves and in favour of Reform. An approach for saying that Reform is right, but do not vote for them is now bound to fail. There may be many Conservatives who aspire, of course, to win back the Red Wall, but that is also delusional to think that it is even remotely likely at the next election. Exactly true as well. Many of those former Red Wall Tories, I haven't covered them. I haven't actually covered them. And maybe we should. But a lot of those former Red Wall Tories have been out there banging the drum saying, "Oh, no, you don't understand. We can retake the Red Wall. Just give us a chance. Give us a chance and we'll retake the Red Wall." Not likely to happen. Not likely to happen at all. But it is, of course, this delusional to think that this is remote likely to the next election. In reality, the Tories are unlikely to come second, let alone even first, in any of these Red Wall seats at the next election. That leaves prioritizing the recovery of its traditional heartlands, the Blue Wall. And I would agree with Gauke on that. You need to make sure your heartlands are safe. Otherwise, you get into a lot of trouble, because if for the next election they go, "Oh yes, we're going to be, appealing to Reform, but also appealing to our Blue Wall voters," well, guess what? All those voters in the Red Wall, why vote for Farage light when we can have full fat Farage? They'll go vote for Reform. And in the Blue Wall, well, hold on a second. We don't like that direction the party is going in. We'll go join the Lib Dems. And then it's not the Blue Wall anymore. It's the Yellow Wall because the Liberal Democrats own it now and have been pulling, as I've said before, some really amazing victories over the past couple of years. And yet the Conservatives still not concerned about the Lib Dems. So one, of course, should not, however, underestimate the challenges this would involve. Given that Lib Dem MPs are now bending themselves into traditional Tory seats, they will now be aided by a new cohort of councillors. More fundamentally, for the past decade, the Conservative Party has done much to antagonise the moderate voters needed to win these seats, which is, again, fundamentally true. It would need to demonstrate it has fundamentally changed. And that ain't going to happen. Who can bring about that fundamental change and demonstrate that? Mel Stride? Think again. There's no one in the current Conservative Party. This is why it is really, truly doomed. There is just a complete dearth of talent left. And that fundamental change, and I've talked about it before, a complete root and branch reform of the party, not going to happen. But trust me, one day, people like David Gauke and Rory Stewart are going to be looked back on and gone, actually, they were right. Because currently now, those two are treated as absolute heretics to the Conservative Party. You look down in the chat and people basically just call David Gauke a Lib Dem. Like, go join the Lib Dems, go join the Lib Dems. Maybe David Gauke should go and join the Lib Dems and prove a point. You know? Why not? So it would also, of course, need to demonstrate that it's fundamentally changed. It needs to restore its reputation for economic credibility, which means that it cannot deny the damage, of course, done by Brexit. Again, the Brexit conversation is one the party will need to have if that change is ever to happen. And, of course, support measures now to mitigate the damage by moving closer to the EU. It should also be willing to be very critical of Donald Trump and wholeheartedly needs to make a case against reform and Farage, not on tactical grounds of vote reform, get Labour, because that would be a very bad idea to get reform at all. This means, for example, it cannot give the impression that the real objective is to form a post-election pact between the Tories and Reform. And bear in mind, should a pact ever happen, let's say we get to the next general election somehow, like, you know, hung Parliament territory, and you end up with like a Reform Tory post-election pact government. Oh boy, you thought the arguments you saw during the past couple of years were bad? Wait until you've got people in government and you've got Tories and Reform butting heads. That is a government that will not last long. That government will not last long, should that happen at all. So it is a strategy I currently favour because it will result in the Conservative Party advocating for policies and values that I believe would be good for the country. A competitive and open market economy, fiscal responsibility, international cooperation, strengthening institutions such as the rule of law, rather than aping wrong-headedness of the populist right. But as a political strategy, it is, of course, the least worst option. Will it be pursued? I very much doubt it. And like I say, Gauke knows it. Gauke knows that. And I will say this now. I will not be surprised. I will not be surprised if David Gauke does join the Lib Dems. I will not be surprised. And I wouldn't be too surprised if either him or Rory Stewart does it first and then one follows the other. I would not be surprised. So, to succeed, of course, in recovering the blue wall, the scale of change needs to be immense. Half measures will not work. It would mean taking on the reform-curious elements of the Conservative Party, driving many of them to defect. Yep, I've said this before. Drive them out. You know, civil war in the party. But that ain't going to happen anytime soon. It would, of course, mean now the enduring endless criticism, you know, right-wing newspapers and GB News. It would mean losing some of the existing support far more quickly than the new support would be obtained. None of this, of course, would make it an attractive proposition. It is nonetheless now the current Conservative Party's last best hope. Is any of that going to happen? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. They are not in any way, shape, or form willing to do that or pursue that. And I think Yeah. Someone says that everything that helped the rise of reform neatly encapsulated into one man. Like I say, I keep on saying this. I've said this through the video. David Gauke considered massive pariah, massive pariah. And then someone has said here, I'm warming to Gawk, but I'm now convinced that he's a Reform UK sleeper agent determined to turn the Tories into the Lib Dems and complete political oblivion so that Reform UK can now be the de facto party of the right and only an alternative government to Labour. Good for him. For Lib Dem, read intelligent, rational, and informed commentator. Um, and yeah, it's all most of it is having a go at Gawk. Really, as I've said, treated as an absolute political pariah now, but hey, give it a few years. And yeah, I said years, not months, because it ain't happening anytime soon. And yeah, eventually, Gawke and probably like Rory Stewart will be looked at as like, oh yeah, they were right all along. They're the ones who we should have listened to. But I'll tell you now, that ain't happening anytime soon. Um, and if anything is to really be shown, politics in the UK is still in earthquake mode, essentially, which is depressing, but it's just the way it is at the moment. You know, anything can happen at an election. But you know, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Um, like I say, unfortunately, I don't think Labour will act in a calm, rational manner after this election, after these local election either. I hope they do. I hope they do act. I hope they take the time and think about, you know, what they could do in response to this. But I worry instead they'll probably have a more knee-jerk reaction, which maybe we'll talk about in another video. But as always, we'll see you all next time.